Thank you all for being here. I know that the program, the schedule said 2 titles, Can't Touch This and No Way Jose. I'm not going to talk about Can't Touch This, it's a very different presentation, but I am going to talk about Jose today. And when I mentioned Jose, who has an idea what I mean with Jose? One hand. Perfect. That means that all of you at least learn one thing, and it is that Jose stands for JSON Object Signing and Encryption. So it's a group of specifications that has a bunch of other specifications under it, within it. And if I mention JSON Web Tokens, who's ever heard of JSON Web Tokens before? Haha, much more hands. That's cool. JSON Web Tokens are a part of the Jose specification together with a bunch of other specifications that I will talk about in this talk. But before we can dive deep into Jose, I'd like to go through the basics of encryption and cryptography in general, because Jose deals with a lot of these things related to cryptography. So, who am I? My name is Bellen. I'm a staff developer advocate engineer at Auth0. I'm a Google developer expert, and you can find me on all of the internet websites as Sambego. I'm a developer, I'm a JavaScript developer, Node developer, and full stack developer, whatever you want to call me. So it only makes sense to me that I'm npm installable. So if you run npx@sambego/about me, download half of the internet, you'll find links to my social media and all my talks right there in your terminal or your CLI. And these slides are available at jose.sambego.tech. I only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to go quite fast because I want to talk about a lot of things. But these slides are here. You can follow along on your device. You can follow them along later at home or whenever you want. These slides will always be available at jose.sambego.tech. And a little disclaimer, I might simplify certain things in order to try to explain them, just because cryptography gets very complicated quite fast, and I will try to stay just on the surface level of them, so you have an idea of what the basics are, but you will probably not be an expert when you walk out of this room. Neither am I, by the way. And please don't reinvent the wheel. When dealing with cryptography, when dealing with these very complicated things, use existing solutions, libraries that have been written by experts, that have been proven to work, that have been proven to be secure, and don't write your own unless you know what you're doing. So, what are we going to look at today? We're going to look at hashing and keyed hashing, signing, encryption, and lastly, that very unknown thing called Jose. So let's get started, because we only have 30 minutes. Hashing. A hashing algorithm is a mathematical algorithm that maps data of an arbitrary size to a bit string of a fixed size, which basically means that whatever input you give it, the output is always going to be of the same length, depending on which algorithm you use. No matter if you put in one word, a whole book, or your whole hard drive, the output of that algorithm is always going to be the same size, depending on which algorithm you use. The initial data is often called the message, and what comes out of those algorithms is called a hash or a message digest. So when I call something a hash or a message digest, it's the output of an algorithm, a hashing algorithm. What goes in is the message. And it's a one-way function, which means you can have an input, run it through the algorithm, you get a hash, but you will never be able to go from that hash back to the original input. It's a one-way function only. Input becomes a hash, the hash can never become the input again. So if we look at the little example, we see different inputs. We have dog, doggo, and a quick brown fox. They're all of a different length, but the outputs are always going to be 256 bits in this example, because it's a SHA-256-bit example that we're using. So no matter the input, no matter the size of the input or the type of whatever it is, the output is always going to be a 256-bit string, in this case, a 256-bit hash. And some of the common hashing algorithms are MD5, SHA-123, and so forth. If you've been on the internet for quite some time, you might have used MD5 in the past to store passwords. We don't do that anymore because there's certain security issues with MD5, but it's still usable for some other non-secure applications. These days, we usually use one of the SHA family algorithms to do more secure hashing. It also stands for secure hashing algorithm, by the way. So we've seen hashing very briefly. A one-way function, the output is always going to be a fixed length depending on the algorithm. Keyed hashing is all of that plus something else on top. So keyed hashes lets you validate the integrity and authenticity of the content of a hash. So it still makes a hash, it's still a one-way function, it's still a fixed length output, but it also allows you to check the integrity and the authenticity of that hash, because you add something on top, which are the keys. And in order to compute this hash, you need a secret key. You can call this a password, whatever you want. It's the key in keyed hashes. And so if we look at the same example again, we have dog, doggo, and a quick brown fox. And instead of running it to a regular SHA-256 algorithm, we run it to a keyed hashing algorithm, again with 256-bit outcome. And our outputs are always going to be 256-bit in this example, the same length, same as with the previous example. So on my function, same as with the previous example, but together with that input, that dog, doggo, and so forth, we also have a second thing, the key, the secret key. In this case, it's called super secret. But depending on that key, depending on that secret key, the outputs are going to be different. So only if you know that secret key, you will get the hashes that you expected to output in this demo. For example, if you have the same input, the quick brown fox, and you input the secret key that is correct, that you know that is the secret key, or you input a wrong secret key, the hashes are going to be different. And this is what allows you to check the integrity and the validity and the authenticity of that keyed hash, just because you are supposed to be the only person or the only instance that knows that secret key. It's supposed to say secret for a reason. Some of the keyed hashing algorithms, HMAX, SHA-256, 384, 512, these are just the bit length outputs, but HMAX SHA is the most commonly used keyed hashing algorithm. And some example use cases, storing passwords, identifying files, cache busting, database indexes. Blockchain also uses hashes under the hood. I'm not going to talk about it. But there's a lot of use cases for hashes and keyed hashes that we use on a daily basis, maybe even without realizing it. It's a very commonly used cryptographic principle. Cool. We saw hashes. We saw keyed hashes. I told you I was going to go fast. I'm going to go even faster now. So signing. Digital signatures offer all properties of keyed hashes, plus cryptographic non-repudiation. And kudos for me for pronouncing this correct on my first try. But basically, a digital signature is everything that a keyed hash is, plus, again, something extra, this cryptographic non-repudiation. Now, what does this mean? According to Wikipedia, non-repudiation refers to a situation where a statement's author cannot successfully dispute its authorship or the validity of an associated contract. Clear, right? To me, it means cryptographic non-repudiation can prove who created the signature. Because we are dealing with something that has cryptographic non-repudiation, we can prove which instance, which service, which person, whatever, created a certain signature. And that instance, that service, can also not dispute that they created it. We can prove that they did it, and they cannot say, I did not create the signature. It's yes or no. Based on the signature, you can prove that they did or did not do that. And cryptographic non-repudiation enables other parties, other than the signer, to check the signature's validity. With keyed hashes, you're dealing with a key, a secret key, which you keep secret to yourself. So only you should be able to check the validity and integrity of that data. With a signature, you're able to share something, a piece of data, to other parties other than yourself. That will allow them to check the validity and authenticity of that signature. So that's a big difference between keyed hashes and signatures. And they mostly use public key cryptography, or also known as asymmetric cryptography, which means that we are dealing with a private and a public key pair. And the way that you create a digital signature is the signer, whoever creates that signature, is going to use their private key, which they keep secret, private to themselves, to create that signature. And once they created that signature, they can send that to whoever needs that signature, together with the public key that belongs to that private key. And using that public key, anybody that has access to the public key, it's a public key, it's public data, can check the validity of the signature. And this is very powerful, which means you can share signatures and anybody can just determine if the signature is valid, if the authenticity is correct. And a signing algorithm is usually a bunch of algorithms, something that generates a public and private key pair, something that signs, and something that can validate using the signature and the public key. So if we look at the same example, we have an input, we run it through a signing algorithm, RSA in this case, we get an output. Usually it also gets hashed before or under the hood, so it's still something that looks a bit randomish. It's not random, but looks a bit randomish. But together with the input, we also have the private key. And we need that private key to create the signature. Once we've done this, we have our signature. We can run that signature together with the original input through a verifying algorithm, together with the public key. And if the public key is correct and the signature has not been tampered with, it's a valid signature, this algorithm will tell you, yep, it's valid, or no, it's not valid. But it's good to remember, you use a private key to create the signature, and use a public key, which you can share with everybody, to validate this digital signature. And some common signing algorithms are RSA, elliptic curve, and Edwards curve. These are families of algorithms. These are not exact algorithms. They're just ways of doing cryptography in general. And some example use cases, JSON Web Tokens, the thing I asked you in the beginning of this talk, are usually signed with a signing algorithm. Sometimes you use a key hashing algorithm, even though this is not always recommended. Most of the times they use a signing algorithm to create the last part of this JSON Web Token, the signature. And when you want to sign documents online, you're also going to create digital signatures of those documents. Last part, encryption, before we can dive into what HOSE really is. When encrypting data, we cannot only ensure its integrity and authenticity. So again, we can ensure its integrity and authenticity, but the data will also stay secret for outsiders, which means if you're not supposed to get access to the actual data, you should not be supposed to get access to that data. So you either need a private key, a secret key, or a password, depending on which algorithm you use, to decrypt that data so you can read the original data. And the encrypted message is often called a cipher. What comes out of an encryption algorithm is very often referred to as a cipher. And there's two types of encryption. You have symmetric and asymmetric. And symmetric is a more simple one, and we usually use this when we have to deal with big pieces of data, when we want to encrypt and decrypt big pieces of data, something like your whole hard disk, something like all of your internet traffic on your Wi-Fi, something like databases. Usually when we deal with big pieces of data, we use a symmetrical algorithm because they're a little bit easier, a little bit simpler, and a little bit faster to work with. These are a few of the algorithms, but this is how it works. It uses the same shared secret, password, whatever you want to call it, to do both encryption and decryption. So you have an input, the king brown fox, you run it through the encryption algorithm together with a shared secret, and then you get your encrypted message. And if somebody wants to decrypt that message, they take that cipher, that encrypted message, together with that shared secret again, and they can get back to the original data. And this is different from hashing and signatures. Encrypted messages allow you to get back to the original input, the unencrypted message, if you have the right credentials, in this case, the shared secret. Asymmetric encryption is kind of the same, but it has one big difference. You don't use the shared secret for both encryption and decryption. You use the receiver's public key to encrypt the message. And this is also different from signatures, where you use your private key to sign and the public key to validate. When encrypting and decrypting data, you're going to ask for somebody's public key to encrypt that data, and then you're going to use your own matching private key, or they're going to use their own matching private key to decrypt that data. So you ask for somebody, can I please have your public key? Use that public key to encrypt the data, send the encrypted data to whoever needs to receive it, and they then can use their private key, which only they have access to decrypt the data and read the data that they just received. Same demo, but again, as I mentioned before, we use a public key to encrypt, and we use the private key to decrypt instead of one shared secret for both encryption and decryption. So that's the difference between symmetrical algorithms and asymmetrical algorithms. And some example use cases are TLS, VPN, SSH, all of these acronyms that we use daily, but probably don't know what they stand for, or at least I don't know. And some of the algorithms are RSA, OAP, and so forth. So let's look at a detailed example. Also, I don't know how I'm doing on time, because I think that's a screensaver, or maybe there's a clock, doesn't matter. The first, so let's look at a little detailed example, RSA. The first thing we need to do, RSA is an asymmetrical family of algorithms, is generating that public and private key pair. And a quick note, cryptography is often based on very large prime numbers. RSA is no secret, is no exception. And is a million a large prime number? Is a billion a large prime number? No, this is a large prime number. You cannot even see it. It's a bit zoomed in. But it's about 150 digits. And I would show you the million and the billion in this, which it looks very small, but it's zoomed in on the screen, so I cannot show you. But we are working with large prime numbers. In this example, I will use small prime numbers, 61 and 53 to be exact, just because it's easier to demonstrate. In practice, you're going to use these very large prime numbers, which have 150 digits or more, just for security. So the first thing you want to do when you want to create a public and private key pair with RSA is you're generating two random prime numbers. Large prime numbers, we're using small ones, 61 and 53, the P and the Q value. And based on these two prime numbers, we're also going to generate a lambda value, which is the least common least common multiple of the two prime numbers minus 1. In this case, it's 780. And we're going to keep these numbers in memory. We only need them to generate the keys, and after that, we can forget about them. Then we're going to generate the public key, which is the modulus, which is the two prime numbers times each other, and the public exponent, which is a coprime of that lambda. It's two values we keep in the private key, and we can share with other people. And the public key, sorry, and the private key contains that modulus again, but instead of a public exponent, it contains a private exponent, which is a different mathematical algorithm. But because these two keys are based on the same numbers, they are mathematically linked because some genius mathematicians have determined that this works this way. And once we've generated these public and private key pairs, we can forget about the prime numbers and we forget about the lambda. We don't need those anymore. We only need the numbers inside of those private and public keys. So using these public keys, we can encrypt a message. And to encrypt with RSA, you're going to take an input, 1, 2, 3, 4, run it to the encryption algorithm, which is the mathematical algorithm in the yellow box in the middle, and input the public key values, which is the modulus n and the public exponent 17 or e, and we get 2183. Remember this number, the input is 1, 2, 3, 4, the output is 1283. If you want to decrypt that message, usually we're not working with numbers, but we're working with other types of data, so we need to do a bunch of data conversion. But under the hood, an encryption algorithm or a signing algorithm, anything cryptographic is always going to be a mathematical operation, a mathematical function. So if you want to use this private key to decrypt a message, we take our cipher, 2183, the output of the encryption algorithm we saw earlier, and run it through the RSA decryption algorithm, and plug in the private exponent and the modulus. And if we do this right, and because they are mathematically linked, we will be able to get back to the original input, 1, 2, 3, 4. I've done the math for you, so you don't need to double check this. But again, it's just a bunch of mathematical algorithms that are mathematically linked because of those prime numbers and those numbers we generated from those prime numbers. And it just works. Again, we usually don't deal with numbers when encrypting data. We're dealing with something else, so we need to do a bit of data conversion. But under the hood, it's always going to be very complicated mathematics. I created a little playground at rsa.sambigo.tech. It's still a work in progress, but if you want to know more about the RSA and how it works, it basically shows you that you can input a string and then you get the encrypted message in certain formats, and it gives you a preview of all the prime numbers and all the numbers that are being used, and it gives you a bit of an explanation. So if you want to know more about RSA, rsa.sambigo.tech, it's still not finished, doesn't work in Safari, but you might learn a thing or two about RSA. Okay, whew, that was fast, right? Now we can move on to the actual topic of this talk, Jose. But because Jose stands for JSON Object Signing and Encryption, I wanted to talk about signing, encryption, and therefore also hashing, because it's all one big family of cryptography. So JSON Object Signing and Encryption, it's a way of doing encryption or sharing encrypted messages or signatures in the form of JSON on the web. And why JSON? Well, the JSON format is often used for serializing and transmitting structured data over a network connection, which basically means that we use it on the internet all the time. Who prefers XML over JSON? Nobody, right? These days, we all prefer JSON because it's much easier to work with, and we use it all the time on the internet. And it also has excellent support in most programming languages. It has first-class support in JavaScript. It comes from JavaScript. But any other language out there either has support for it natively or has a very good library that knows how to deal with JSON. So no matter which language you prefer, you should be able to work with JSON quite easily. And most of the specifications within the group of specifications, Jose, start with JW and then something JWT, JSON Web Tokens is the one I mentioned, but there's a bunch more of things within the Jose specification. The first one is a JSON Web Key. And as you might guess, a JSON Web Key is a representation of a key, a public key or a private key in the form of JSON. So if you look at an example, this is an example of a public key, an RSA, public key in the form of a JWK. And you can see that it tells us a bunch of information about what this key actually is. It tells us it's an RS-256 algorithm that uses this key. It tells us the N value, the E value, the key ID. And if you remember the N and the E value, these are the modulus and the public exponent that we talked about when generating those RSA keys in the more in-depth demo. So the N is the modulus, which is the two prime numbers times each other, and the E is a coprime or the least common multiple of the lambda value, I believe. So all of those values are inside of this JW key in the form of JSON, standardized, and a structure that we all know how to work with if you follow the JW key specification. Next up, JSON Web signatures. And these might look very familiar if you're familiar with JSON Web tokens. They look kind of the same. Usually, they are 3 parts of a string concatenated by a dot. And where the first one is the header, the second part is a base64 encoded JSON object, which is called the payload. And the last part is the actual signature of those 2 first structures of this JWS. So the Jose header tells us which algorithm we use to sign this payload, this JWS. The payload can be anything that's valid JSON. If it's valid JSON, you can put it in there. It can be a string, a number, an array, an object. Doesn't really matter. If it's valid JSON, you can put it in the payload. And the signature is basically you take the header, you take the payload, and this is an HMAC SHA-256 example, so this should be another algorithm because it's not a signing algorithm, but let's forget about that. Together with the private key, and if you run it through that, you will get the signature, which you can then add to that JWS. Next up, JSON Web Encryption. Again, it's just a way of sharing encrypted data on the web. And instead of having 3 parts, it has 5 parts. It has the header again, it has the encrypted key, the initialization vector, the ciphertext, which is the actual encrypted message, and lastly, the authentication tag. And this one is a little bit more complicated, where with signatures, you had a header which told you which algorithm to use, you had the payload, which is the actual data you wanted to sign, and you had the signature. This is a bit more complex. JWEs use 2 kinds of encryption. You know that we saw that there's symmetrical encryption algorithms and asymmetrical encryption algorithms. JWEs use both of them at the same time. And the content encryption key is usually encrypted with an asymmetrical algorithm. And the content encryption key, if you look at this, is the second part of this string. It's the actual key that we need to decrypt the actual cipher. But this key is encrypted again for security reasons using an asymmetrical algorithm. So if we want to, and the cipher is then encrypted using this content encryption key, which you first have to decrypt. So how does this work? First of all, we look into the Jose header, and it tells us a bit of information about which algorithms have been used, both the asymmetrical and the symmetrical one. It also tells us a bit about which key we need to look for, the key ID of the key we need to decrypt that content encryption key. So the first thing we need to do is decrypt that content encryption key, the second part of that string, which we'll use to actually decrypt the cipher, the actual encrypted message of this JWE. So bear with me, it gets a bit complex, but we're almost at the end of this. So we look into the header, which algorithm to use, RSA OAP, okay. We use a library that knows how to deal with this algorithm. And we input the content encryption key, which is the second part of this string, together with the private key that has the key ID also mentioned in this header. So we know which algorithm to use and which private key to use to decrypt this content encryption key. And if we input all the right data in an algorithm, in a library, in a function that knows how to deal with this algorithm, we are able to decrypt this content encryption key. That's the first part of encryption. The first type of encryption used in the JWE, the asymmetrical ones, we use a private key to decrypt this content encryption key. Once we've decrypted this, we can actually decrypt the cipher, the encrypted message inside of this JWE. And again, we look inside of our header, it tells us which algorithm to use, and we use a library, a function that knows how to deal with this, this algorithm. And we input the cipher, the encrypted message, the decrypted content encryption key, so the content encryption key we decrypted in the previous step, the initialization vector, which is the third part of the string and sometimes empty, and the authentication tag, which is the last part of the string. And if we've done everything correctly, and we've decrypted the content encryption key correctly, and we've inputted all of the right things into this correct algorithm, we should be able to decrypt the actual content of this JWE. And both JSON web signatures and JSON web encryption can be serialized as compact, as a string. We've seen this in these previous examples. The JWS had 3 parts, header, payload, signature, and the JWE had 5 parts. But it's called Jose, JSON object signing and encryption for a reason. They can also be serialized as JSON. And this is a JWS in the form of JSON, where you can still see you have a payload, you can still see you have a header, and you still have the signature in there. It's just a standardized JSON structure for transmitting or working with signatures using Jose. And the same thing is true for JWEs. Instead of being in this 5-part string, it can also be a JSON object where you still have all the things you had in that large string. You still have the encrypted key, you still have the header, the ciphertext, IV, the initialization vector, authentication tag. They're still all in there, just in a different format, in a standardized JSON format. So why do you want to use one or the other? If you have to send something along with every request, for example, a JSON Web Token, you might want to serialize it as compact, just because it's more compact to send with every request. If you don't need to send it with each request, but you do need to do a lot of programming, a lot of logic on these JSON objects, you might choose to use the JSON version instead of the compact version. So lastly, I mentioned JSON Web Tokens a few times. I think most of us have seen this before, but a JSON Web Token can either be a JWS or a JWE. A JSON Web Token is nothing special. It's either a JWS or a JWE. 99.999% of the time it's a JWS, a JSON Web Signature. But the caveat is that they are always going to be serialized as a string. That's why when you look at a JSON Web Token, it's always going to be the string version, never the JSON object version, just because JSON Web Tokens are tokens that are often sent in web network requests. So we try to keep them as small as possible. So again, the difference is that the header tells you which algorithm to use to validate the signature, but it also tells you that it's a JSON Web Token, and sometimes it gives you a bit more information about the JSON Web Token as well. And the payload is going to give you some information about whatever this token is going to be used for. An access token will give you some access to an API. So the payload usually contains some information that's related to accessing an API, like who issued it, your authorization server, for which user, the subject, which audience, which API is it usable for, which scopes, and so forth. If you have an ID token, which is also JSON Web Token, tells you a bit more about the identity of a user, so the nickname, name, picture, things like this. And if you have a depop proof, it's basically going to prove you that an access token is valid for a certain request. So you'll see some more information about that proof, that request that this access token is going to be used for. So depending on the use case of a JSON Web Token, the payload is going to be different. But in the end, a JSON Web Token is always going to be a serialized, compact serialized JSON Web Signature, or very sometimes, very sometimes, a JWE serialized as a string. Why do you want to use a JWE? If you want the content, the payload of that token to stay secret for anybody but the receiver. So if you decide to put something sensitive in that payload, you usually should not do this, but if you want to do this, you can use a JWE instead of JWS. But 99.999% of the time, it's going to be a JWS, a JSON Web Signature. So let's summarize. Hashing compresses and makes it virtually impossible to get to the real data. So on my function, the output is always going to be a fixed length depending on the algorithm. Keyed hashes do everything that a hash does, but it also protects the integrity of the data, just because it adds that secret key on top of hashing. Digital signatures allow third parties to verify the validity and origin of data, just because we use this public key and private key, and we use the private key to create a signature and a public key which we can share with anybody to validate the signature. Encryption allows only authorized people to read the data, just because you need your own private key to decrypt the message, or a shared secret, depending on which algorithm you use. And Jose is a set of standards based on JSON that will help us with the signatures and encryption on the web. It is a standardized way of transmitting signatures or encrypted messages in the form of JSON or a string on the web. These slides are available and will always be available at jose.sambigo.tech. JWT.io tells you a bit more about JSON Web Tokens. RSA.sambigo.tech is the little playground I showed you where you can learn a bit more about RSA. And if you're interested in the SHA-256 hashing algorithm, it's very complex, but this website that is not created by me, but somebody way smarter than me, tries to explain you the SHA-256 algorithm. It's very complex, but it's really nice to see how it works under the hood. That being said, thank you very much.